Under Dr. Webb's leadership, and with tremendous support from a mighty PAFA museum team, shout out to all the museum team members in this room, John Rhoden's artistic legacy is in loving, intellectually fierce, and dedicated hands. Please welcome Dr. Brittany Webb.
Thank you for that, and for such a rich day. It's been a dream to have this project come out of my head and into the world so that we all get to look at it and talk about it. And it is really a thrill to get to end this day with an address from Imani Perry, who I have the esteemed pleasure of getting to introduce. Dr. Imani Perry is an interdisciplinary scholar and writer giving fresh context to African American social conditions and experiences along dimensions of race, gender, and politics. Currently, Dr. Perry is a Carol K. Fortsheimer Professor, Harvard Radcliffe Institute, and the Henry A. Morse Jr. and Elizabeth W. Morse Professor of Studies of Women, Gender, and Sexuality, and of African American Studies, and co-founder of the Black Teacher Archive at Harvard University. That is a lot of roles at Harvard. Perry received a BA from Yale University, a PhD from Harvard University, a JD from Harvard Law School, and an LLM from Georgetown University Law Center. Perry is the recipient of numerous awards and honors, including a 2023 MacArthur Foundation Fellowship. Yes, we can pause for applause. Perry's recent book, South to America, A Journey Below the Mason-Dixon to Understand the Soul of a Nation, won the National Book Prize for Nonfiction. And it's been enriching to read it while thinking about the ways John Rhoden's life, education, and world travels impacted his sculpting practice in terms of his early points of entry as a kid, seeing another artist at work, and lifelong impulse to create work at every scale, from decorative fixtures to his home, to over life-size sculptures for museum exhibitions and public commissions, and the ways that impacts what American art is and where it comes from, when the historic record doesn't always reflect that story in its fullness.
Come on, but we pulling it today.
In South to America, Perry writes, "We, the darker children of Alabama, have inherited the scraps of industry and made something of them, the same as we did with the land and African languages and cultures. Our artists have told the story."
Come on.
It is a pleasure to welcome to the stage a most esteemed and artful storyteller, Dr. Imani Perry.
Hey. I want to begin, thank you for that introduction. I want to begin by expressing my deep appreciation for Brittany. What an unbelievable job. Yes, indeed. And Lori and the entire team at PAFA for putting together this stunning exhibition.
That's right.
And the fantastic exhibition catalog. All of the presenters today. I'm so glad I was here all day because I learned so much and I was so deeply moved. The work that you all have done is an inspiration, and I anticipate that it will have a long-term impact in the world of art, art history, and Black history. I also want to say it's wonderful to see members of the Rhoden family here today. One of whom I know through Chicago connections, funny enough, not Birmingham, but there's a route. It's not only from Mississippi to Birmingham, Mississippi to Chicago is also a Birmingham story through that pathway. And I also, there's been all of these sort of wonderful moments of kismet today. Like earlier today, there was a discussion of Dawood Bey's, one of his photographs of Rhoden being in the archive. And this morning, Dawood Bey said to me, "Oh, I used to hang out with Rhoden all the time." And there's just all these, and I was with him a week before last at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts for his exhibition symposium. So there's all these wonderful moments of kismet. The other thing I'll say before I begin in earnest is that I had a very immediate emotional reaction to walking through the exhibition. Both the first, when I was able to come, and Lori and Brittany so generously allowed me to come see before it opened the pieces, and then the complete form of the exhibition. It's such extraordinary, evocative work. And of course, the part of that is my own association of Rhoden with my home of Birmingham, Alabama. I am an archive junkie too. Oh, wait, also this study, I also wanted to say, and thank Kellen in particular for this. The archive is extraordinary. It is a wonderful thing to have be accessible. I dug around, and I'm an archive junkie, and I'm also nosy. So I was snooping around. I was like trying to find threads of connection. I always look in these archives and think maybe that's my cousin. He wasn't like it could. It's not my cousin. That's all right. But I did notice some threads of connection that I just want to mention. One is I was moved to see the 1985 citation from the city of Birmingham. With the name of the city council members, but also the first black mayor of Birmingham, Richard Arrington, who, when I was an infant and before, was the dean at Miles College, where my parents met, a historically black college in Birmingham, and my dad was actually his first campaign manager when he ran for city council. And this sort of hometown care is evident in the archive that moved me. There's also a beautiful note from an administrator at Miles saying that she appreciated that Rhoden never forgot his home folk. There's also an interesting correspondence between the very famous architect Elliot Noyes and Rhoden about a potential commission, and that's was of interest to me because Elliot Noyes' son, Fred Noyes, was part of this small group of white scholars and professionals who came down to teach at historically black colleges in the South in the late 60s and early 70s, and Fred taught at Miles College and spent a lot of time hanging out with my parents. And also moved to Massachusetts at the same time my mother and I did. So there are all these sort of familiar threads that excited me about the archive. But I didn't want to just be sentimental in this offering today, although I have an inclination towards that. I want to offer something about Rhoden and his legacy in larger context. And you will, for those of you who were at the afternoon program, you'll see that there are some resonances. And those of you who weren't, I encourage you to watch it, but also to read the exhibition catalog to get a sort of deeper context for some of these. But to that end, I'm going to make really three interrelated points, and then maybe point in some future directions of research. The first is that I think it's essential for Rhoden to be understood as the product of a black Southern academic tradition. He, as we've heard earlier today, he graduated from Industrial High School in Birmingham, later named Parker High. That's how most people refer to it, as Parker, which was named after the man who was the principal when Rhoden was a student there, and had the distinction of being referred to for many years as the largest Negro high school in the United States. And Parker, or Industrial, was in some ways the kind of jewel in the crown of a statewide movement that began in earnest amongst black Alabamans, or Alabamians, depending on your choice, in earnest in the 1870s. Movement to not only provide quality education for black students in Alabama, but to create a highly networked and professionalized community of educators. And they did so under the banner of the Alabama State Teachers Association. That was a professional organization of black teachers in Alabama, and also an organization called the National Association of Teachers in Colored Schools, which was a national organization, but the leadership was largely people in Alabama. And these professional organizations of educators produce publications, which is, I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about that in conversation with Rhoden, in part because I am the co-director of a project which is called the Black Teacher Archive, where we have digitized the proceedings, the bulletins, the publications, the journals that teachers of these statewide Black teacher organizations produced in the first half of, largely in the first 2/3 of the 20th century. And like the Rhoden Archive, we've been committed to making them widely accessible, and so that you don't have to have access to a particular library or you don't have to travel to a rural county in order to be able to see the work that folks were doing. And so what I want to draw on today comes out of putting those materials in part in conversation with Rhoden's archive. Now, in recent years, historians have labored to establish that Industrial High School was a singular institution when it came to music education, largely under the leadership of John Tuggle Watley, referred to as Fess Watley, Fess being short for professor. And in addition to being a trumpet player and a band leader, he was arguably the most influential educator when it came to Black music in the 20s and 30s. Graduates of the very extensive music curriculum that they had at Industrial I'm going to say Parker because I'm just more comfortable with that. At Parker began to take positions in those years as in many of the leading bands. So there was a time in jazz where people would say, if you don't have a musician trained at Parker, your band is not complete. They had very sophisticated music education. And so just as an example, Rhoden was a student at Parker 4 years behind Sun Ra and a couple years behind Erskine Hawkins. So school was understood as a center for Black music. And that has in some ways that has been submerged, and we part of what we're talking about today is submerged histories. Part of that has been submerged for some decades. There's more attention being drawn in increasingly, but even more submerged than the role of Parker in the history of music is the role of art education in Black schools in general, including Parker. So part of what I did in preparation for this talk is to read through journals produced by these organizations that were called then Colored Teacher Associations, and look at how they talked about fine art education, right? And one of the things you find in articles in these publications is that there's a lot of discussion of the value of fine art appreciation, as was arts education, there was attention to materials, color theory, and also the educators talking about the importance to have adequate time to devote to the visual arts. And think about this is early 20th century, right? So that's part of it. And we had some discussion earlier about Parker in particular being a place where visual art was displayed, and also that when Rhoden graduates from Parker and goes to Talladega, a more rural part of Alabama, another historically Black college. He meets Hale Woodruff, who was a professor at Atlanta University. Hale Woodruff was a product of Pearl High in Nashville, which was known as one of the most distinguished high schools for Black students in the country at the time. It's also my grandmother's alma mater. And he taught. It does not appear that he taught Rhoden at Talladega, but he met him there. But he did teach courses at Talladega and more extensively at Atlanta University. And so this person who provided some mentorship for Rhoden is often written about in the journals as a model of Black fine artists. So, for example, in an article published in 1944 by a teacher from Tennessee, she says, Hale Woodruff is a most commendable painter and designer of block prints. His painting ranks high with other commendable American painting. His style in the language of the critics is fresh and intelligent. Reference has been made to two of his paintings, Shantytown and Mud Hill Row, as having social value. She also mentions that he went to Pearl because that was important for people from Tennessee. Now, relevant to Rhoden is that in 1938, Hale Woodruff installed murals at Talladega, and one included an image, a mural of the Amistad Revolt, slave ship revolt. And it's embedded in a design in the lobby floor of the library at Talladega. And this is the year that he leaves for New York, that Rhoden leaves for New York. And so you can imagine Woodruff was working on this mural while he's a student there. Now, college tradition since that time has been that students are not supposed to walk on the ship. You're supposed to walk around it, despite the fact that it's really in the center of the library. The series of murals that Richard that put together at Talladega explore various significant moments in Black history, right? The enrollment in schools after the American Civil War, et cetera. There's some talk about that show the construction of campus buildings. So I want you to imagine Rhoden seeing this installation being planned as he himself is on his way to New York, right? And as Dr. Otter described earlier, the moment when Rhoden makes his slave ship piece, there's a sort of renewed interest in the history of slavery that's happening at the time, right? So you're talking about the publication of Beloved and the legacy of Roots, etc. And it occurs to me that it was probably something triggered in his artistic imagination, his critical imagination, both thinking about that period in history in which he was living, but also the tradition of the sort of narrative art around the history of slavery that emerged on the campus of the school he attended. Another piece by an educator that I think reflects part of the sort of social context in which Rhoden was able to become an artist refers to actually sculpture quite specifically. She writes, "Beautiful pottery and sculpture created by the hands of Negro youth will come from the rich clays that lay bare along our roadsides, and all our surroundings may be enriched by the arts." And so we know one of the things that there is this sort of more recent renaissance of recognition of folk and outsider and self-trained artists out of the South in particular, Black artists out of Alabama in particular. But I think one of the things that's missing is the thread of connection to being covered through noting how educators saw the future of fine art dependent on the cultivation of these folk traditions, in particular sculpture, that existed in the Black South, and Brittany Webb gestured toward this earlier beautifully. Okay, so Rhoden moves to New York in '38, and with the encouragement of Hale Woodruff. One of the people he meets is Augusta Savage, a sculptor, herself a product of Florida schools. Who you may recall if you've read about Augusta Savage, began making figures with clay. It's a different texture clay in Florida, but making figures of clay as a young child before getting formal fine art training at Cooper Union. He began studying with sculptor Richmond Barthé. Barthé was from the Mississippi Gulf Coast. He and both Savage and Barthé initially exhibited their work at county fairs. She in Green Cove and Palm Beach, and he in Bay St. Louis. And Barthé talked about being first encouraged to become an artist by his fourth grade teacher, Inez Labat, from Bay St. Louis Public Schools, who influenced his aesthetic development and is one of the people who encouraged him to display at the county fairs. This is all, and Labat was president of the local, what was called Color Teacher Association in the area, right? So these educators were both sort of nurturing individual children, but also were part of cultivating this sense of the value of the arts. And that relationship between that and then what you get at the county fairs and other kinds of civic organizations is part of what I refer to as a kind of robust Black associational life, right? Where people have this sort of wide range of civic and social and gatherings where they are actually sort of sharing with each other both culture and also intellectual and artistic work. So my point is that when we trace the genealogy of Rhoden, and then also the artists who brought him, who nurtured him into the fine art world, one of the things that we see is that they all come through these schools that were part of these tightly networked educational cultures, right? And even when we think about the fact that Rhoden, in many ways, built his career was able to sustain himself, and I know this because Brittany told me this early on, was able to sustain himself through commissions that these folks set the stage for that. Woodruff was constantly doing commissions, largely for Black institutions. And the idea of these works of art is that I would say they fit into what a kind of ethos of not just a kind of classical culture, but actually in establishing a kind of dignity in Black history and culture, part of kind of Black formalist tradition, right? So it was important to honor historic figures, to have them on your walls, a kind of reflection back to the student body, to tell the story of Black people in epic and elegant terms, inclusive, of course, of incredible adversity and brutality, but also of resilience and resistance, as evidenced by the Amistad mural. Now, also, these institutions became feeders, in a sense, right? And they were feeders through individual connections, but they were feeders to the fine art world that they would enter. And they provided places, even when those artists sort of, Rhoden didn't have to do this work, but we see this with both Woodruff and Barthé at various moments. They return and teach at Black institutions, right? So they have, even with this sort of mainstream success of a certain sort, they get much of their livelihood from Black institutions. And so I want to say that Rhoden in part emerges from that tradition. Second point, another tradition that I think it's important that he emerges from, and it's what I am calling, and our historians, please feel free to roll your eyes at me because this is not my training, but I'm going to name something, what I'm calling an Alabama Black materialist art tradition. It's one that is primarily, I think, comprised of self-taught artists like Joe Minter and Lonnie Holley and the quilters of Gee's Bend, but it's also a tradition that connects to fine artists like Rhoden or Jack Whitten, and musicians as well. And so let me describe what I mean. Classically, philosophical materialism, right, is produced by a systematic study of nature, and that one theorizes about the world out of that. In this branch of what I think is a kind of artistic materialism, it's one in which the artist's imagination emerges out of an examination of the physical materials of the environment, and with an understanding that those materials at hand have everything to do with the political and social economy of the place. Right? So Alabama, and Kate mentioned this earlier, has this interesting history as both an agricultural and an industrial state. Right? Steel and coal, as well as the red clay and the loamy soil, right, that shapes, and they all shape the tradition. Right, so that even when we think about the Gee's Bend quilter was working in cotton, right, which was once the economic engine of the state, right, are part of this tradition. Right? And among one observation, right, in arguing for this tradition, I'd say, is that you see the importance of repetition in the artistic works that come out of this tradition. Repetition of shapes, a kind of rhythmic quality, which in some ways is a reflection of the repetition of various forms of labor, the kind of repetitive work, whether it's in a mine or in a field or in a foundry, right? Even if you take someone further back, someone like Bill Traylor, who was had been enslaved and who painted post-emancipation, painted on cardboard in downtown Montgomery, and was a self-taught artist. You see the example of this rhythmic repetition in his work. Whitten, son of Bessemer, adjacent to Birmingham, another steel mill town, the son of a miner, right, was also in this sort of in this artistic tradition that was a negotiation between sort of the physical environment and how human beings navigated it. So Whitten, for example, made his own tools to apply paint, right? And at one point had a 12-foot long brush that he made. I guess y'all don't think that's funny. That was funny to me. and separated pigment from medium. He thought about paint as a kind of skin, and he made all these sort of relief, like he would cast objects and he would find things, whether it's plaster or manhole covers or tires, right, and repeat shapes in a kind of rhythmic way. We look at a musician, Fess Whatley, before he became the sort of the dean of the Parker High musical tradition. As a child, would make instruments out of the sort of the found objects in the yard, right? So empty wooden cigar boxes. He would pull he would find metal springs and stretch them over to make these kind of makeshift guitars. And the like, and he also would borrow his daddy's hunting horn, and he called that his first trumpet, long before he became a trumpet player. And one of the things that is interesting, just to talk about, to sort of thread the needle a little bit between Rhoden's work and this larger tradition and also the musical tradition, is that it is, when you look at the images of bodies in Rhoden's work, you can see a kind of resonance with instrumentation and music, right? The use of brass and wood, of course, but also the shapes and the repetition that has a kind of rhythmic quality. So in various ways, experimentation with materials, right, that were of the environment, were integral to shaping a kind of artistic imagination in this sort of this Alabama Black materialist tradition, and really was an exploration of the relation between the Black imagination and I would argue the desire for freedom, in a context in which Black people were often bound to the land and the material conditions in coercive relation. It's a sort of harnessing of the relation in a new kind of negotiation with the material. I even think of some of the scale of Rhoden's larger pieces. These enormous pieces make me think of, on one level, the old, mills and mines, but also, of course, of Vulcan, the 56-foot tall statue in Birmingham of a Roman god that sits on Red Mountain. But what's interesting, and you see this in both Rhoden's work and also in Joe Mentor's work, is that the use the large metallic figure in their work often is produced with references to Ogun, the Yoruba Orisha that deals in metals, and I don't think that's incidental, irrespective of how deliberate it is or something like that. So all of that is sort of some of the contours of what I think this tradition is. I also think Rhoden might be understood relatedly to in relation to George Washington Carver, whose legacy loomed large in Alabama as he was coming of age. Carver is not understood adequately as a fine artist, but he was one. Though he was not a native of Alabama, that's okay. He spent the majority of his life there, and was impacted by the way people he encountered out in the country beautified their environments. Just as an aside, for those of you who have not spent time in Alabama, if you drive out in the country, art is everywhere. Yard art, people make things. Sculpture is commonplace, and Carver observed all of the ways that people beautified, when he got to Alabama, beautified their environments, and sort of took that up as a formal practice. So one of these teachers in one of these journals who went to observe Carver's studio wrote the following, his art studio. She wrote, "There's an art room whose walls are covered with George Washington Carver's framed paintings in oil, charcoal, watercolor, vegetable color, and original clay paint. And then there were Christmas cards, china paintings, and pen and pencil sketches. Here was also the painting of the peaches done with his fingers, destined to go to the Luxembourg Gallery in Paris at his death." She went on to say, move. I won't quote that. I'll just say this. He also made paints. So he one of the things that Carver was attributed to Carver is he found the formula for Egyptian blue at 2,000 years after it had been lost. And so all these people from paint companies came down to Alabama to try to buy it from him. So he really was a materialist who made beautiful things in relation to the particular environment. If you ever are at the Carver Museum in Tuskegee, you can see the paintings that he made. He did lots of landscapes and floral paintings and the like. Now, when I think of Rhoden's work in Indonesia, I also think of that tradition, and I don't think that's a leap. Carver was hugely influential to Black education throughout the state of Alabama. Tuskegee had produced lots of the educators at Parker High. And so this idea of having this sort of creating out of the organic environment would have been quite familiar. Another thread to follow might be to think about how Rhoden's relation to wood and to metals and the rendering of bodies in flexing, the kind of muscularity that appears in the kind of repetition of the organic shapes, even in metal, and the totemic quality of much of the work is suggestive of indigenous Muskogee cave art, as well as the mound art culture of the Mississippi. And I don't mean the state or the river, but the nation of people, indigenous people. And so Barte comes from the place that is, Bay St. Louis is sometimes called Mound City. It's very approximate. So there's this thread, this repetition of forms, as well as, of course, the African-American yard traditions, right? And of course, this is all a jazz aesthetic as well. Repetition with variation and with play, of course, is at the core of the jazz aesthetic. My third point about the legacy of Rhoden, and I'm eager to get in conversation, so I'm not going to go on too much longer. I find myself really stunned when I look to how vast this extraordinary archive is that y'all have so generously prepared for all of us who are fascinated by him. And not just the vastness of the archive, but that he achieved recognition, was incredibly accomplished, right? This is not the sort of conventional story of the artist who went undiscovered, right? But that itself is instructive, that he was recognized and yet has in many instances has become unrecognized in the contemporary moment, right? And I think this has to do with a couple of things. One is the tendency for us to talk about first and onlys. Yeah, right? I mean, and they often make us, when we talk about first and onlys, they often make us stop looking once we have one or two from a period. And this is actually part of what I think has been that is so remarkable both about the symposium and this exhibition, because what has been clear is that he has been placed in a community, but also the visibility of the community of people who brought this to fruition is instructive, right? So it pushes, the exhibition itself pushes against discourses of first and onlys, right? That there's always sort of these sort of collaborative presences in what we do see. And then the other piece of that is that if we solely look to a certain kind of representation, right, we can miss entire, not just figures, but entire traditions or sub-traditions of art. And I want to talk a little bit about, related to that then, about Rhoden's sort of work for the State Department as an art specialist. As part of the International Cultural Exchange and Fair Participation Act of 1956, right? And he certainly is sort of part of that, deployed as part of that. I don't know how we Cold War civil rights diplomacy is the nice way of saying it, and worked in an official capacity. But I also think, I was sitting and thinking about his work in this capacity, and I was thinking about a couple of different threads. there. It's a little inchoate, but I hope you'll sit with me for a minute. One is that, and I'm not sure if he was at the sort of 1956 conference at the Sorbonne of Black artists and writers, but I was thinking about this essay that James Baldwin wrote about that time, about being at that conference. And he talks about how W.E.B. Du Bois kind of throws haymakers at it from afar when he says, if you see any Black Americans there, essentially saying they're basically sellouts, because if you actually have any radical politics, they won't let you out of the country. And Du Bois had his passport revoked. And Baldwin, this is young Baldwin, so he's kind of like, well, no, that's not necessarily true. We are here, we exist in it. And it's interesting, Baldwin tries to make an argument then, he changes, right? This is why you always have to follow the long arc of someone's work. But at that moment, Baldwin is saying, we exist in this kind of weird relationship with the West, us Black Americans, because we kind of exist in this country where freedom is possible. Again, 56. And is trying to sort of negotiate the emotional complication of being in that space, which I think we ought to attend to. There are points, but I do think we should be mindful, and this is, I'll gesture for a moment to another really important resource of what it meant to occupy that space and to get those resources, but not necessarily to be invested in the politics of the U.S. nation state. For example, 56 is the year when, Louis Armstrong has been doing this work, and then eventually he's like, yeah, you're not going to send me around anymore. I see what y'all are doing, right? And Dizzy Gillespie is critical, but there are other folks, so people are having this complicated relationship. Rashonda, in an article, Rhoden's wife, in an article in a Black newspaper, is quoted in 56 as saying, and they're in what was then Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, as quoted as saying, the problem that Africa has is so many ignorant white people, right? So there's complicating, there's clearly probably a critical lens that's happening at that moment, and of course it comes to a head after in a different way after the protests around the assassination of Patrice Lumumba years later. But I do think that it is interesting and worth exploring further. Perhaps there's something to be found in Rhoden and John and Rashonda going to Bandung, where in 1955 there was a historic convening of Afro-Asian solidarity. And I point this out because there's one issue that is Cold War politics, and then there's the other layer which is about colonialism. And so often the people of newly, sort of emerging in a decolonial moment, newly emerging free nations in Africa and Asia, really trying to assert themselves outside of the influence of these Western powers anyway, and finding these points of connection. So to go to the point made earlier about there is something to be found in the enduring relationships between people who were either Jim Crowed and colonized across the borders of nation states, irrespective of what their formal relationship was to those nation states, whether they were being sponsored by them or silenced by them. The fact that those connections were sustained, it speaks to the idea that people were really just trying to figure out how to get free outside of these imperial negotiations. And they were imperial negotiations. I will say that even as a good leftist in the context of the Cold War. So these kind of extensive networks are worth tracing. And the last thing I'll say is this. I really do hope that this moment initiates what could be understood as a Rhoden renaissance of sorts. There's just so much work and so much work yet to be done. And I also hope that witnessing this allows us to shift the way that we talk about artists, not simply as known or unknown, or as folk or fine artists, or as just as taught or formally trained, but as parts of traditions that emerge from communities that may include all of the above and more. that bore extraordinary fruit. I will stop there. Thank you all so much.
Yeah, we have time. Thank you so much, Imani. Are there questions from the audience that we can pose?
Or comments.
Or comments? Absolutely, thank you.
Yes.
Oh,
Hi, friend.
Hi, friend. Nice to see you again. Thank you so much.
I just wanted to thank you, Dr. Imani Perry, for giving us a really in-depth view of the artist, his life, his background, the soil from which he came from, and speaking in ways that both incite further examination of his art and his life, which is really relevant. I have two children, 16 and 20. My daughter's at Temple, and my son's at LaSalle Boys College High. And I am very proud to know and hear about his works. I've known some things about him, but many things you spoke about I did not know. And being that my mother is from Alabama, and we went there every summer, and I know you're from
I'm a
Alabama.
booster.
Yeah, yeah. It's really important to acknowledge people of the diaspora, recent or very distant, in terms of time and lineage and generations, and what the accomplishments have been, not just today or in this month, which is known as Black History Month, but all year long, going forward. And I want to thank the employees and directors of the Philadelphia Academy of Fine Arts for making this presentation possible as an educational standard for young and old. Thank you.
I agree. I would echo that appreciation. Thank you all so much.
any other? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Imani Perry. Imani.
Yes.
It was, I loved kind of more your free-ranging talk. I loved the different strands you were bringing together. And I was struck by what you mentioned about first and only.
That's right.
Yeah. I had the privilege of curating a show on Henry Ossawa Tanner
Yes.
here at PAFA in 2012. And he is definitely one of those firsts, right? He's always cited as a first. And something I was very conscious of, and I was made aware of moving to Philadelphia, that he was part of this vibrant Black middle-class community, particularly as part of the AME Church. And something Brittany has always been really clear about saying is John Rhoden was not an undiscovered artist.
Right.
We are turning a light back on him, but he was successful in his
Yes.
time, and he was part of the art world. He won every award. And what we have to think about is, how is it that so many of us have not heard of John Rhoden?
Yeah.
Right? Why did that happen?
Yeah.
And why do we know about the firsts and the onlys, and why do we do that? And not celebrate this larger world.
Yeah, it's well. First, I want to thank you because I brought my now 20-year-old child to that Tanner exhibition, and when he walked out of it, he said, "That's what I want to do." And now he's a musician more than an artist, but we're hoping he comes back to the art world. But I do, one clue that I found is, if you go through, talk again about the power of digitized archives. So when you go through the archives of historically Black newspapers, of which there were hundreds, Rhoden is all over them. And if you visit Black institutions, Rhoden is visible, right? So part of it has to do with, and this is like a soapbox that I'm on all the time amongst academics, Because academics have the bad, even in my field, in Black Studies, have the bad habit of talking on and on about how there's all these gaps in the archive. And I'm always like, because not everything is at the Beinecke Library at Yale. There's a lot of other places that have archives, and many of them are Black institutions. And so part of it has to do with how those of us who are scholars are trained to look for materials, and that there are some real deficiencies that come from a couple of, one is the assumption of where, and that has to do with training. I don't think this is a sign of people not being like great people, but I think we are trained out of being familiar, we're trained out of looking to the institutions that Black people have maintained as important resources, one. And there's also the incredible inequality of resources between institutions. So for example, one of the issues that in my archival project that we've confronted is that there are some places where there are abundant archives, but the papers haven't been processed because there's no money to process the papers, right? And so part of what we have to do is think about sort of how does one address those inequalities, and not in a way that's just for the interest of scholars, because it may be that processing those papers are not the most important thing for a given institution, right? So I think that's a part, but I love the question because we have to ask the question, right, as we move forward. Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Imani. Thank you so much for sharing your research with us. I'm so happy to be here tonight and learn a lot with you. I have a question related to his experience in Africa. Mm-hmm. In your research, did you have a chance to see about his experience in Africa? How, for example, the contemporary African tradition or the traditional African tradition influenced Rhoden?
I'm actually probably not the best person to ask about this, honestly. I mean, I will just say it's a cursory view, and this is not, I think Dr. Webb is probably the better person to ask about this, but there is clear aesthetic influence of art from across the African continent in his work. But I don't know if there's something you'd want to add to that.
I'll be quick.
Okay.
Go ahead, you better.
No, because I saw some more hands up, and people have heard me talk a lot today. So I will say that one of the things that I hope people got from there's an area of the exhibition where we put in some of the travel slides, and I thought it was really important for us to see the travel slides of him in Nairobi working with carvers, because one of the things that I understand from the time in Africa is I did come across those articles where it seemed like Rashonda had been too honest in front of too many reporters.
Right.
That got reported in several U.S. newspapers differently depending on the outlet.
Right.
And it was really interesting to see some of the headlines about that story, like essentially, what an American artist's wife is saying on a delegation overseas. And I wonder what the conversations about that were like. I think in terms of the traditions, I think being trained by modernists in New York in the 1950s provided one particular view of African art, which I think a lot of people talk about as, art in Africa is more than just source material for Western modernists. But I appreciate that one of the things we see when we look at photos of him working in Africa is that it seemed like he wanted to connect with anyone who was making any kind of sculpture, regardless of how the sort of like art world views of it thought about, fine art or popular art or tourist market art. That the archive suggests that whoever was making sculpture was somebody who was interesting to him, and that I think is really telling.
Thanks. Do you have a question, Kate?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, we do.
Thank you so much for your talk. I could not love the coinage more, Alabama Black materialist art tradition. I think that is so spot on, and I love it, I love it, I love it. I'm thinking about this, and I love how it plays with sort of bringing together academic art traditions like that of George Washington Carver, who is very much working in a university setting.
Yes.
And traditions that have been relegated
For margin,
Yeah, as folk or self-taught or outsider, the work of somebody like Joe Minter, going back in time, even thinking about Noah Purifoy, like coming into contact with Carver. And I'm so interested in that, and I loved how you connected it to the rhythm of labor and then rhythm and repetition in these works. And something I've been playing with, and I was thinking about this as you were talking because you spoke a little bit about Fess Whatley too, who of course at Parker, then Industrial, was also teaching printmaking.
That's right.
And I'm so interested in
I completely
thinking. I'm getting to a question. Okay,
go ahead.
That's such an interesting connection, right? It's important. And I'm thinking about the work you're doing with the Black Teacher Archive, which seems so important to me. And I'm really curious about how fine art and music are being written about in dialogue in what you're seeing in those materials.
That's interesting.
Is there a little more fluidity or play than we today tend to think about those things as having in that moment, particularly in Black communities? Because I've been thinking yes, but you've got the sources.
Well, it's yes, but it's not ideal, right? The archives don't necessarily yield exactly what you want, but there is this sense of the whole child. I think one of the things I'm interested in is actually how one of the things we've forgotten is how much sort of Deweyan philosophies of education shaped what Black teachers were doing in the South and all the laboratory school movement. So you see these pieces where people are talking about the whole child, working with the hands, the development of aesthetic sensibilities, physical education, art, music. They're all conceived of as part of how you cultivate the child, right? And so they're not sort of talked about sort of the various arts together, but the entirety. And it really is important too, because among scholars, the debate between industrial and classical education has kind of overdetermined the conversation, right? It's always Booker T and W.E.B. And there's a lot more going on in terms of what people are trying to, particularly after Washington dies, where people are actually just trying to say, okay, we're not interested in that divide. We obviously don't want exclusion from classical education, but there's a lot of attention to building not as a sign of just sort of vocational education, but its connection to math and its connection to science, and this, and arts is part of that, right? So that's a great question. But we, members of the team yesterday, we were trying to pull all of the art articles that we could find. So I have to go through more of them. But it's a great. There is much more there than one would anticipate. I think before. Yeah.
I'm done. Thank you. Yes. Okay. Thank you, Imani Perry. This one maybe. Okay, I think we should wrap because it's 7:30, and
Thank
I
y'all.
want to respect everybody's time. Thank you all for coming tonight. It was an incredible honor to have you, Imani Perry. Everybody, we hope to see you again at PAFA soon. Thank you for coming.